The first time Miriam Bell saw the bobcat at the garden fence, the morning fog still lay low over the bean rows, and every cedar rail was silver with dew. She had stepped onto the back porch with her yellow mug warming both hands, meaning only to check whether the late April frost had spared the tomato seedlings. The old porch board gave its familiar, tired creak under her left slipper. Somewhere beyond the pasture, a mourning dove called once, then fell quiet. It was the kind of stillness Miriam had learned to trust in the years since her husband died, a stillness that let her hear small things before the rest of the world woke up. A drip from the gutter, the soft click of the garden gate latch shifting in the damp, the nearly soundless scrape of claws on wood. Miriam stopped halfway down the porch steps. At the far side of the vegetable garden, just beyond the cedar fence, a bobcat stood among the tall, wet grass, as if she had been placed there by the fog itself. She was small for an adult, thin through the ribs, with a tawny coat darkened by rain and mud. Her short tail flicked once, black tip twitching. One ear held a shallow notch near the top, and her left hind foot rested lightly, not quite bearing her full weight. But it was her face that kept Miriam still. The bobcat's amber eyes were fixed on the garden, not with the pleading look of a stray dog or the boldness of a barn cat, but with the measured watchfulness of a creature deciding whether one more step in this world was worth the risk. Miriam did not move. She had lived 67 years in the Willamette foothills, long enough to know that wild things did not arrive at a person's fence by accident. They came because something had pushed them there. Hunger, weather, pain, memory, sometimes motherhood, though Miriam did not think of that yet. For a long breath, woman and bobcat looked at each other through the fence rails. The garden smelled of wet soil, onion shoots, and the coffee Miriam had forgotten to drink. A small breeze moved the prayer flags her neighbor Elise had tied to the fence last winter, each faded square lifting and falling without sound. Then the bobcat lowered her head, not in surrender, only to sniff the base of the fence, where last evening Miriam had dropped a handful of carrot greens while thinning the rows. The animal's whiskers trembled. One whisker on the right side bent oddly, as if broken or worn short. She touched the damp leaves with her nose, decided against them, and lifted her gaze again. Miriam's hand tightened around the mug. "Well," she whispered, too softly for the word to matter. "Good morning to you too." The bobcat's ears turned toward the sound. Her body did not run, but every muscle gathered itself, ready. Miriam knew that posture. She had seen it in deer along the roadside, in raccoons by the compost bin, in herself during the first year after Harold's funeral, whenever someone knocked unexpectedly, and she had to remember how to answer a door alone. So she took one slow step backward. The bobcat watched. Miriam took another. The old porch board creaked again, and the animal vanished so quickly the fog seemed to close around the place where she had been. No crash of brush followed, no frantic scramble, just absence. Miriam remained with one hand on the porch rail, listening to her own heart settle. She had not realized how lonely the garden had sounded until that wild face disappeared from it. Inside the kitchen, the clock above the stove ticked toward 6. The house waited in its usual way, one plate drying beside the sink, one pair of boots by the mat, one chair pulled out at the table, because Miriam still never pushed Harold's chair in all the way. She set her mug down beside the seed packets and looked through the window at the fence. Nothing moved there now except the fog. It would have been easy to tell herself she had imagined it. Easy, too, to turn the moment into a simple story for Elise later. Bobcat by the beans gave me a start, gone before breakfast. But Miriam did not laugh. She stood quietly in her kitchen while the kettle began its small rattle on the stove, and she felt a tenderness rise in her chest, so sudden it almost embarrassed her. The animal had not come to be loved. Still, Something about the way she had waited at the fence, not coming in and not fully leaving, had reached a place in Miriam that had gone unused for a long time. For those listening to quiet stories like this one, Miriam would have been the sort of woman who never asked for much attention. But if a gentle story ever found its way into someone's evening, she would have hoped they might leave a small kindness behind. A like, a subscription if they wished to return, and maybe a comment saying where they were watching from and the name of an animal that once changed the shape of their heart. That morning, Miriam did not know any of that, of course. She only knew the fence looked different. She poured fresh coffee into the chipped yellow mug and carried it back outside. This time, she stayed on the porch. She did not cross into the garden. She did not call. She did not put out food, though the thought passed through her with the speed of concern and the weight of temptation. Instead, she sat in the wicker chair Harold had repaired twice and should have replaced 10 years ago. The cushion held the night's damp. She tucked her robe around her knees and watched the spot where the grass had bent beneath the bobcat's paws. A robin hopped along the fence rail, cocked its head at Miriam, and seemed to scold her for being awake before the sun. Somewhere in the shed, a mouse rustled near the sack of potting soil. Miriam almost smiled at the thought that the bobcat had probably known about that mouse before Miriam knew about the bobcat. The garden slowly revealed itself as daylight gathered. Pea vines curled around their strings. Water beads clung to the edges of cabbage leaves. A clay pot lay tipped near the gate where last night's wind had pushed it over, and Miriam made a note to set it right. She made notes about many things. Buy twine, sharpen pruners, call Elise about the rhubarb, replace the loose screw on the latch. Little instructions to keep a life moving forward. But beneath all of them now was another note, unwritten and heavier. Watch the fence. When the sun finally touched the top of the cedar rails, Miriam rose and went about her morning chores with more care than usual. She filled the bird bath, checked the seedlings, and righted the clay pot. Near the gate, she found 2 small impressions in the mud where the bobcat had stood. Not deep, not dramatic, just the faint oval marks of a wild neighbor who had paused close enough to be remembered. Miriam crouched slowly, her knees complaining. The paw prints were already softening at the edges. She did not touch them. She only looked. Then she glanced toward the woods beyond the pasture, where Douglas firs stood dark against the brightening sky. The bobcat was somewhere in there, invisible now, carrying her hunger or hurt or secret purpose back into the trees. Miriam felt the morning open around her, wider than it had been an hour before. She went inside and wrote one sentence on the back of an old seed envelope. Bobcat at garden fence, April 23, just after dawn. Then she underlined the word fence, not knowing why it mattered so much. By noon, the fog was gone. By evening, Miriam had nearly convinced herself the bobcat would not return. Wild creatures had their own maps, their own boundaries, their own wisdom. They did not owe lonely women second visits. Still, before sunset, Miriam washed the yellow mug and set it ready beside the coffee tin for morning. And when she checked the back door latch that night, she paused longer than usual, listening beyond the porch light, toward the garden, toward the cedar fence, toward the dark place where 2 amber eyes had looked in and left the whole house feeling less empty. Before the bobcat came to the fence, Miriam Bell's mornings had been so orderly that even the house seemed to know its part. At 5:30, the furnace clicked once in the hall. At 5:35, the kitchen pipes knocked when she turned on the tap. At 5:40, the kettle began to breathe on the stove, and the window over the sink clouded with steam. Miriam would stand there in her blue robe, watching darkness loosen above the pasture, while her fingers found the chip on the rim of the yellow mug without needing to look. Harold had chipped it years earlier while trying to carry 2 mugs, toast, a newspaper, and a jar of blackberry jam all at once. He had claimed the mug looked more honest afterward. Miriam had rolled her eyes then. After the stroke took him on a wet November afternoon, she drank from it every morning, as if that crescent of missing glaze had become a place where memory could rest. She lived in a small white farmhouse outside Maple Hollow, Oregon, where the lane curled past hazelnut trees and ended beneath a leaning cedar. The house had once been too busy for loneliness. Harold repaired bicycles in the side shed. Their daughter, Nora, had filled the porch with muddy shoes and school books until college carried her east, then work carried her farther. Neighbors used to stop by without calling, borrowing tools, returning pie plates, and leaving zucchini on the steps when Miriam had not asked for any more zucchini. Now the house held sound differently. The refrigerator hummed too loudly at night. Rain in the gutters had a hollow voice without Harold snoring in the next room to soften it. Miriam had not become bitter, but she had become careful. She cooked soup in small pots. She learned not to say something aloud unless there was someone near enough to answer. She still worked 3 mornings a week at Granger Seed and Supply, a narrow old store that smelled of burlap, dust, onion sets, and oiled wood. She kept the seed drawers labeled. If someone lingered over tomato packets, Miriam would quietly say, "That one forgives mistakes," and slide over Harold's favorite variety. On the days she did not work, she tended the garden with the patience of someone who had nowhere urgent to go. The garden had been Harold's idea. He had built the cedar fence after deer ate nearly everything in one reckless night. He set each post himself, crooked but stubborn, while Miriam held the level and pretended not to notice that the level was lying. The gate latch never lined up perfectly. It clicked twice when closed, once for the metal catch, and once for the little wooden shim Harold had added after supper with a grin full of apology. That latch became part of Miriam's days. Click, click in the morning, click, click at noon, click, click before dusk. Sometimes she spoke to it as if it were a fussy old dog. All right, I heard you." The latch never improved, but it never failed her either. Elise Monroe, who lived half a mile down the road in a cedar-sided cottage, said Miriam's garden looked like the kind of place that remembered everyone ever loved there. Elise was a school bus driver with a laugh that arrived before she did. She brought biscuits wrapped in dish towels and pretended they were mistakes from a recipe that had gotten out of hand. Miriam pretended to believe her. Once, Elise tucked marigold seeds into Miriam's apron pocket and said the garden needed a little nonsense. By July, the marigolds had taken over one corner like cheerful trespassers. A scrub jay stole peanuts from the porch rail and scolded her when she was late. The neighbor's orange tomcat, Pickle, visited only when he wanted to sit on the warm hood of Miriam's truck, leaving dusty paw prints across the windshield like a signature. But comfort was not the same as company. That was the part Miriam never said. People rushed toward loneliness with solutions, and most solutions made it sound smaller than it was. Join a club, visit more, get a dog, sell the place, move nearer to family. Every suggestion came from kindness, but none understood the shape of the silence in that house. Miriam did not want to be rescued from her life. She wanted her life to answer back now and then. The morning after she saw the bobcat, she woke before the furnace clicked. For a few seconds, she lay still beneath the quilt, listening. The room smelled faintly of lavender sachets and old pine boards. Pale light rested along the dresser, where Harold's pocketknife still sat in a shallow dish with 2 foreign coins, a bent screw, and a button no one had matched to any shirt. Miriam turned her head toward the window. The garden was only a gray shape beyond the glass. She told herself not to hurry, By the time she reached the kitchen, she had already made 3 promises in silence. She would not chase the bobcat, she would not guess what the animal needed, and she would not let tenderness make her foolish. She had heard enough warnings from farmers and rangers to respect shark teeth and sharper fear. Still, when she poured coffee into the chipped yellow mug, her hand trembled enough to send a brown crescent over the rim. She wiped it with her sleeve and frowned at herself. The porch was cold under her slippers. A thin mist floated between the garden rows. The fence waited. No bobcat. Miriam stood there longer than she meant to. A chickadee landed on the gatepost, bounced twice, and flitted away. The clay pot she had righted yesterday leaned again, stubborn as a bad habit. In the soft mud near the fence, the paw prints had faded until they looked more like questions than proof. She stepped down, crossed the wet grass, and stopped at the gate. Click, click. The sound moved into the morning, small and familiar. Beyond the fence, at the edge of the trees, something tawny slipped between sword ferns and vanished before Miriam could breathe its name. A short tail, a notched ear, a silent, careful turn of the head. The bobcat had not come close, but she had been watching. Miriam stood with one hand on the crooked latch, feeling the old emptiness inside the house shift slightly, as if it had heard footsteps outside, and lifted its head. Miriam saw the bobcat fully again 4 mornings later, though by then she had begun to feel watched, even when nothing showed itself. It was Saturday, and the valley had taken on that soft, damp brightness that came after 3 nights of spring rain. The pasture grass stood high and shining. The hazelnut trees beyond the lane were dressed in new green, and the air smelled of wet bark, crushed mint, and the faint sharpness of onion shoots. Miriam had gone out early with a basket on her arm, meaning to cut rhubarb before the day warmed. She had almost reached the bean trellis when the robin on the fence rail made a hard little alarm sound. Miriam stopped. At first, she saw only the trellis, the sagging row cover, the dark soil between her boots. Then the tall grass beyond the far corner of the fence parted without wind. The bobcat stepped into view. This time, there was no fog to soften her. She looked thinner in clear light. Her coat, tawny and gray-brown, clung in uneven tufts along her sides. Mud dried in a narrow streak above one shoulder. The notch in her left ear was easy to see now, a small missing crescent against the morning. Her left hind leg hovered a heartbeat too long before each step. Not useless, not broken, but guarded. She placed that paw as if the earth might answer with pain. Miriam did not speak. The bobcat lowered her head and slipped through a gap where the bottom rail had loosened near the blackberry canes. Harold had meant to fix that rail before his final winter. Miriam had meant to fix it every spring since. She had always found some other task that could be done without remembering his hands on the wood. The animal slid into the garden soundlessly. Miriam's breath caught. A wild bobcat stood inside her fence, no more than 20 feet away, between the bean trellis and the row of young lettuce. She was not large, but the garden seemed to rearrange itself around her. Every leaf became still. Every bird held back its voice. Even the old gate latch, hanging slightly crooked, looked as though it had gone quiet out of respect. The bobcat sniffed the ground with quick, delicate movements. Her nose touched a place near the compost where mice sometimes tunneled beneath the straw. One ear turned toward Miriam, while the other tracked the shed. She did not look confused or tame. She looked busy, anxious, and deeply aware of being somewhere she had not chosen lightly. A field mouse broke from under the rhubarb. The bobcat moved faster than Miriam's eyes could follow, but the leap ended short. Her injured leg faltered, and she landed awkwardly beside the lettuce, scattering damp soil. The mouse vanished beneath the fence rail. The bobcat froze, tail twitching in two sharp beats. Miriam felt the failure, like a small ache in her own knee. The animal stood very still, head lowered. Then she did something Miriam remembered long afterward. She lifted one front paw and touched the flattened lettuce leaves once, almost as if offended that the garden had witnessed her miss. Miriam pressed her lids together, not quite smiling. There was something proud and embarrassed in that tiny motion, something so alive that it made the whole morning warmer. "You're having a hard time," Miriam said softly. The bobcat's head snapped toward her. Miriam regretted the words at once, though she had barely breathed them. The animal crouched. Her shoulders rose. Her ears flattened sideways, and a low sound moved through her body. Not a roar or a hiss exactly, but a warning made of breath and distance. Miriam lowered her eyes. She knew better than to stare. She knew better than to reach. Still, her heart had leapt ahead of wisdom, and she had to pull it back like a child from a road. "All right," she whispered, mostly to herself. "I heard you." She backed up one slow step. The bobcat watched every inch of the movement. Miriam backed up another step, then another, until the porch steps touched her heel. Only then did she sit, lowering herself carefully into Harold's old wicker chair. The basket remained in the grass where she had dropped it. 3 rhubarb stalks lay beside it, red and green and ridiculous, like party ribbons in a room where no one had agreed to celebrate. For several long minutes, neither of them moved. A drop of water fell from the gutter into the metal watering can. Plink! Another followed. Plink! The bobcat's ears twitched at each sound. She sniffed the lettuce, rejected it, sniffed the path, then moved stiffly toward the bean trellis. She paused near the clay pot, the same one the wind kept tipping over, and gave it a cautious tap with her front paw. The bobcat sprang backward. Miriam covered her mouth with one hand, not because it was funny in a careless way, but because the sight of such fierce caution, startled by a harmless clay pot, filled her with tenderness. The bobcat glared at the pot as if it had shown poor manners. Then she stepped around it with exaggerated care. That was the first warmth the animal gave the garden. The second came moments later when Pickle, the neighbor's orange tomcat, appeared on the hood of Miriam's truck and saw the visitor. His tail puffed into a bottle brush. He opened his mouth, made no sound at all, and backed off the hood so slowly he seemed to be melting. The bobcat glanced at him once, found him unimportant, and returned to sniffing the fence line. Pickle disappeared under the truck with wounded dignity. Miriam let out one quiet breath through her nose. The third warmth came when the bobcat found the overturned basket. She leaned in, sniffed the cut rhubarb, and sneezed. Once, twice. Then she stepped away as if Miriam had personally grown something offensive. Miriam looked down at her hands in her lap. She had spent years filling mornings with tasks so grief would not have room to sit beside her. Weed, water, mend, sweep, label, fold. A person could survive a long time that way. But watching the bobcat move through Harold's garden, limping and proud and unwilling to ask anything of anyone, Miriam felt a recognition she did not welcome and could not deny. The animal was not hers. The garden was not a rescue center. And yet, something wounded had crossed a boundary Miriam herself had been afraid to cross for years. When the bobcat finally reached the loose rail, she paused before slipping out. She looked back once, amber eyes bright beneath the notched ear. Not grateful, not friendly, only aware. Then she vanished into the blackberry canes. Miriam sat until the sun reached the porch steps. Only after the birds began talking again did she rise and retrieve the basket. The lettuce was flattened, the rhubarb insulted, and a clear line of paw prints marked the damp soil from fence gap to trellis. Miriam did not smooth them away. She went inside, opened the kitchen drawer where Harold had kept odd screws and seed labels, and found the number Elise had written months ago for a local wildlife rehabilitator named Jonah Pike. Then she stood by the phone for a long moment, looking out at the loose rail. She had learned something that morning. The bobcat did not need a neighbor who rushed toward her. She needed one who knew when to stand still. Jonah Pike did not sound surprised when Miriam called him. That, more than anything, steadied her. She had expected alarm, perhaps a lecture, maybe the quick impatience of someone who had heard too many worried residents turn every wild visitor into an emergency. Instead, the wildlife rehabilitator listened while Miriam stood at the kitchen window with one hand wrapped around the phone cord and the other resting on the sill, watching the loose rail in the cedar fence. He asked simple questions. How long had the bobcat been near the property? Was she dragging the leg or only favoring it? Had Miriam seen discharge from the eyes or nose? Was the animal approaching the porch or staying near the garden? Had Miriam tried to feed her? At that question, Miriam glanced toward the counter where a small saucer sat empty and guilty beside the sink. She had taken it down that morning, then put it back, then taken it down again. She had not filled it. Still, the thought had been there, tender and reckless. No, she said. I almost did. Jonah's voice softened, as if he understood the confession beneath the answer. Almost is different from did. Miriam looked out at the garden. Rainwater still clung to the bean strings. The clay pot had fallen over again, and the sight of it made her think of the bobcat's offended little leap backward. She looks hungry, Miriam said. She may be, Jonah answered. But hunger alone doesn't mean we step in close. Not with a bobcat. Give her space. Keep pets inside. Don't corner her. Don't try to touch her. If she's still mobile, she may recover on her own. If she gets weaker, we'll reassess. Miriam nodded even though he could not see her. What can I do? For now, water. Plain water set outside the fence, not on the porch. Place it where she can reach it without coming near your house. Then walk away. Same time, same place, quiet routine. Let her decide whether the place means safety or pressure. Miriam wrote the instructions on the back of a seed catalog with Harold's old carpenter pencil. Water outside fence. Keep distance. No sudden movements. Call Jonah, if worse. Then Jonah added, and Mrs. Bell? Yes? Don't mistake trust for permission. Miriam held the pencil still. The words found a place in her before she knew why. She had lived long enough to know how often love tried to rename itself as ownership. Parents did it, spouses did it, grief did it most of all, reaching for the past and trying to bring it back inside the house. But wild things had to remain wild, or whatever bond formed would be built on need instead of respect. I understand, she said. After she hung up, Miriam stood in the kitchen for a while, listening to the clock above the stove and the faint ticking of rain cooling on the roof. Then she took a shallow blue enamel bowl from the pantry. Harold had used it for picking strawberries, and one side was dented from the year he dropped it off the back steps. She washed it twice, though it was already clean, and carried it outside. The air smelled of wet cedar and wormy soil. She moved slowly through the gate. Click, click. The latch sounded too loud in the damp morning. Miriam looked toward the trees before each step, though she saw nothing. She placed the bowl beyond the far corner of the fence, 3 feet from the loose rail, where the grass opened into a narrow animal path. Not inside the garden, not near the porch. A respectful place, a neighborly place. Then she backed away. It felt strange to leave care behind like that, without staying to make sure it was received. Miriam had spent most of her life caring with her hands. A lunch packed, a coat mended, a forehead touched for fever, a plate kept warm. Distance felt like neglect until she reminded herself that for this animal, distance was the kindness. By late afternoon, the bowl was still full. Miriam did not move it. At dusk, while she was pulling on her sweater near the back door, she heard Pickle make a muffled complaint from the porch. The orange tomcat had appeared for his usual inspection of the truck hood, but instead of climbing up, he sat by the tire, with his tail wrapped tightly around his paws, staring toward the garden as if filing an official objection. "I know," Miriam murmured through the screen. "She has more important business than you." Pickle looked over his shoulder with deep offense, then walked away with the stiff dignity of a church usher. That was the first small warmth of the new routine. The second came the next morning, when Miriam found the blue bowl empty and turned upside down in the grass. At first her heart jumped with worry. Then she saw the muddy paw prints around it. The bobcat had not merely drunk and left. She had studied the bowl, circled it, nudged it, and apparently decided it should not sit upright without her approval. A thin crescent of mud marked where a paw had pressed the rim. Miriam crouched outside the fence and smiled despite herself. "Well," she whispered, "you're particular." She refilled the bowl and set it in the exact same place. The bobcat did not appear while Miriam was watching. She never gave Miriam the satisfaction of clear gratitude. But signs began to gather like little notes left in a careful hand. Bent grass near the rail. A faint line in the mud where the short tail had brushed a fern. One small tuft of tawny fur caught on the blackberry cane. Once the blue bowl had been moved 2 full feet away and wedged under a fern, as though the bobcat preferred shade with her drinking arrangements. Miriam obeyed. She put it back in the same place anyway. On the 4th evening, Elise stopped by with a paper sack of biscuits and found Miriam standing behind the kitchen curtain. "You look like you're spying on your own beans," Elise said. Miriam touched a finger to her lips. Elise's eyes widened with delight and caution, both at once. She stepped softly to the window. Beyond the fence, the bobcat had emerged. She stood in the amber wash of early evening, ears high, body angled toward escape. Her notched ear glowed at the edge. She approached the bowl in a crooked path, never straight, pausing after every few steps to test the air. Once she opened her mouth slightly, drawing scent across the roof of it, then froze when Elise's biscuit bag crinkled. Elise went still as a fence post. The bobcat stared toward the house. Miriam did not breathe. After a long moment, the animal lowered her head and drank. Her tongue touched the water in quick, silent laps. She kept her injured hind foot tucked close, resting only the toes. When a crow called from the firs, she lifted her head so sharply that droplets scattered from her whiskers. Then she stepped back from the bowl and sat, not relaxed, not safe, just seated, with her tail curled tight and her eyes on the house. Elise whispered, "She's acting like she lives next door and doesn't approve of your curtains." Miriam nearly laughed, but swallowed it into a small breath. That was the third warmth. Elise, holding biscuits against her chest, standing beside Miriam in the kitchen while a wounded bobcat judged them both from the edge of the garden. When the animal slipped away, Miriam remained by the window. The sky had turned lavender above the hazelnut trees, and the first evening chill pressed against the glass. She thought of Jonah's warning, and of the 3 feet between the bowl and the fence. 3 feet was not much in a human life. It was the length of a step, a reach, a small surrender. For the bobcat, it was everything. So Miriam kept the distance. Morning after morning, she filled the blue bowl and left. Evening after evening, she checked it without hope pressing too hard against her ribs. Sometimes the bobcat drank. Sometimes she ignored it. Once she left a vole near the rail, not as a gift exactly, but as proof that she was still a hunter when the leg allowed it. Miriam did not touch that either. She only stood at the fence with her yellow mug cooling in her hand and felt something in her quiet life begin to take shape around restraint. Care did not always move closer. Sometimes it waited 3 feet away. For nearly 2 weeks, Juniper remained a creature of edges. Miriam did not call her that aloud at first. One afternoon, while pruning the herb bed, she caught the sharp scent of an old juniper wreath in the shed, and the words settled in her mind. The bobcat moved that same way along the garden's edge, green-shadowed and watchful, leaving only a trace after she passed. Miriam wrote juniper on a seed packet and tucked it beside Harold's carpenter pencil. It was not possession, it was a way to think gently. The bobcat made no sign that she cared what humans named the space around her. She came when she chose, drank from the blue enamel bowl when it suited her, and vanished whenever a truck slowed or a crow landed too loudly in the cedar. Her limp had improved, though she still placed her left hind foot with care. Once, Miriam watched her clean the bent whisker on her right side until the whole world seemed to wait. Spring deepened around them. Pea vines climbed. Lettuce recovered from its earlier insult. Every morning smelled slightly different. Lilac near the back steps, damp cedar after rain, sun warming the porch boards. And always, if Miriam was patient enough, the muskier trace of wildness near the fence. She learned juniper's timing without meaning to. The bobcat favored dawn, and again just before dusk. She rarely crossed into the garden anymore. Instead, she stayed beyond the cedar rails, traveling the same narrow path through the grass, stopping at the loose rail. Miriam began carrying her yellow mug to the porch before sunrise, and sitting without expectation. That was harder than it sounded. She had expected Harold's boots by the mat long after they were gone. She had expected grief to become smaller if she behaved properly. It had not. With juniper, Miriam practiced something different. She prepared the blue bowl. She opened the crooked gate. Click, click. She set the water 3 feet beyond the fence. She returned to the porch. She waited. If the bobcat came, Miriam watched. If she did not, Miriam watched the empty place without turning it into disappointment. Some mornings, warmth arrived anyway. One day, Juniper found a fallen clothespin and batted it twice with her paw, then leapt back when it flipped over. She circled it with grave suspicion before leaving it where it lay, defeated but not forgiven. Another morning, Miriam sneezed so suddenly that coffee sloshed onto her robe. Juniper sprang straight up from the ferns and landed offended. Miriam whispered, "I apologize for my nose." The bobcat stared as though no apology could be sufficient. A third time, Elise arrived with biscuits and tried to stand quietly beside the porch rail. She lasted almost 1 minute before whispering, "My left foot's asleep." Juniper turned one ear toward Elise, then the other, and walked away with the dignity of a judge leaving court. Elise whispered, "She knows I'm unserious." Miriam smiled more that week than she had in months. Still, the distance remained. Then came the morning of the slow blink. It had rained overnight, steady enough to darken the cedar fence and bead every leaf in the garden. Mist hung between the hazelnuts beyond the lane. The air felt cool against Miriam's cheeks. She had slept poorly, dreaming Harold was outside fixing the fence, though when she called to him through the window, he never turned around. The dream left her tender and unsettled. She carried the blue bowl out before coffee. The gate gave its click-click, softened by rain. At the far corner, she bent to place the bowl beside the fern. Juniper was already there. Miriam saw her only after she straightened. The bobcat stood 6 feet beyond the bowl, half screened by blackberry canes, her coat dark along the spine, her amber eyes level with Miriam's knees. She had arrived without a sound. Her notched ear tilted forward. The bent whisker caught a drop of rain and held it like a bead of glass. Miriam's whole body wanted to step back quickly. She lowered her gaze and kept her hands open at her sides. She could hear water ticking from leaf to leaf. Somewhere behind her, Pickle scratched beneath the truck and then thought better of coming out. The garden smelled of rain, mud, and crushed mint. Juniper did not crouch. She did not hiss. Her tail tip moved once. "You found me first today," Miriam whispered. The bobcat's ears twitched. The blue bowl sat between them, not quite a bridge, not quite a wall. Just water in a dented bowl, placed by one creature and considered by another. Juniper lowered her head slightly, then lifted it again. Her eyes narrowed. For one startled second, Miriam thought the bobcat was growing weaker. Then she saw the rest of the animal's body remained alert and balanced. The blink was deliberate, slow, a closing and opening of amber eyes, without fear, without sleep, without surrender. Miriam had seen barn cats do it from sunlit hay bales. She had seen Pickle do it from the truck hood when he wished to appear generous. But from Juniper, it felt different. Not affection as people like to imagine it. Not trust fully formed. More like the first loosening of a nut tied for survival. Miriam's throat tightened. She did not blink back dramatically. She only let her own eyelids soften for a moment, then looked down toward the grass, giving the bobcat the privacy of not being stared at. When she lifted her gaze, Juniper had stepped to the bowl. She drank with quick, neat laps, while Miriam stood near the fence, rain gathering in her hair. The left hind foot stayed planted more firmly than before. After drinking, the bobcat pushed the bowl with her nose, turning it until the dent faced east. Even tenderness did not excuse improper bowl placement. Miriam's laugh came out as a breath. Juniper looked at her, unalarmed. Then the bobcat turned and disappeared into the wet ferns, leaving the bowl upright for once. Miriam stayed there long after she was gone. The dream of Harold still lingered, but it no longer hurt in quite the same way. She looked at the fence he had built and imagined him pretending he had planned the loose rail all along. Back inside, Miriam wrote on the seed envelope, "Slow blink, rain morning." She did not run. Then she set the envelope beneath the yellow mug, as if the words needed to stay warm. By the middle of May, Juniper had become part of Miriam's mornings, without ever becoming predictable. That was the first lesson the bobcat taught the little farmhouse. A wild creature could form a routine and still belong entirely to herself. She might appear beside the cedar fence 3 mornings in a row, sitting beyond the loose rail, with her front paws tucked neatly beneath her chest. Then she might vanish for 2 days, leaving Miriam to fill the blue bowl, check the mud for signs, and remind her own heart not to make demands. When Juniper did come, she arrived almost always before the sun touched the hazelnut tops. Miriam would step onto the porch with the yellow mug in one hand and her garden gloves in the other. The porch board would creak under her left foot. The gate latch would answer with its familiar click-click. And somewhere beyond the far corner of the fence, the grass would shift once, low and smooth. Not a greeting, not a promise, just Juniper. She had grown steadier on the injured hind leg. She still favored it after damp nights, but she no longer placed each paw as if expecting pain. Her coat had begun to fill out where the rain had made her look ragged, and the tawny fur along her shoulders caught the early light in a way that made her seem both near and untouchable. The notch in her ear remained. The bent whisker remained. So did her habit of stopping exactly where the fern shadow touched the fence, as if she had measured a boundary only she could see. Miriam learned to work with that boundary. She weeded slowly. She watered from the old green can with the split wooden handle. She spoke only when her voice felt softer than the birdsong. Most days, she talked not to Juniper directly, but into the morning, the way a person might speak while folding laundry in a room where someone else happened to be reading. "The beans are sulking," she would murmur. Juniper would blink from the grass. The beans heard me and remain unmoved. The bobcat would turn one ear, then study a beetle crossing the dirt with far more interest than any human opinion. Miriam found comfort in that. Juniper did not flatter loneliness. She did not rush to fill it. She simply occupied a place in the day, and somehow that was enough to make the whole day feel less hollow. At Granger's Seed and Supply, Miriam caught herself checking the clock by the front register, wondering if Juniper had visited after she left. She would straighten packets of pole beans and think of the Bobcat's careful paws. She would weigh seed potatoes for customers and remember how Juniper sniffed the clay pot every morning as if expecting betrayal. One Wednesday, Mr. Haskins from the dairy farm asked why she was smiling in a sack of fertilizer. Miriam looked down and realized she was. "No reason worth explaining," she said. He nodded as if that made perfect sense, because farmers knew better than most that not everything living on a property could be explained neatly. The warmth of the new routine gathered in small, ordinary pieces. One morning, Miriam found the blue bowl exactly where she had placed it, but a single fern frond had been pulled across the rim. Juniper had apparently decided her drinking water required curtains. Miriam set it right, and by evening the fern was back. After that, she let it stay. Another morning, Miriam hung a damp dish towel over the porch rail, and later saw Juniper crouched beyond the fence, staring at the towel's slow flutter with grave suspicion. When the wind lifted it, the bobcat gave one sharp sideways hop, then pretended she had meant to do that all along. A third morning, Elise left a paper bag of biscuits on the porch with a note that read, "For you and not for your judgmental neighbor." Miriam laughed so quietly that Juniper looked offended anyway. The bobcat never came closer than the fence. That mattered. Sometimes, visitors made careless comments when they heard. Elise had told only one person, who told one more, and by late May, Maple Hollow had begun to murmur about Miriam Bell's bobcat. A man at the feed store said she ought to get a photograph. A woman at church wondered whether someone should trap the animal before it caused trouble. A teenager on a bicycle slowed near the lane one afternoon, phone in hand, until Miriam stepped onto the porch and looked at him over her glasses without saying a word. He pedaled away very fast. Miriam called Jonah again that evening. "She's not acting aggressive," she told him, "but people are beginning to be curious." "Curiosity can be worse than fear," Jonah said. So Miriam became careful in new ways. She did not speak of Juniper at the seed store. She asked Elise to keep the story small. She moved the bowl deeper beside the fern so it could not be seen from the lane. She fixed the loose rail enough that Juniper could pass beneath it, but no dog could push through easily. Harold would have laughed at the arrangement, half repair and half invitation. Miriam stood back afterward with the hammer in hand, imagining his voice. "That'll confuse everybody, Mim." "It already has," she whispered. Juniper inspected the changed rail at dusk. She crouched, sniffed the new nailheads, backed up, circled once, and finally slipped under with such clean silence that Miriam felt she had been judged and barely passed. The bobcat crossed 3 feet into the garden, not toward Miriam, but toward a row of young carrots. There she sat. Miriam was kneeling near the peas, tying vines with soft twine. She did not turn fully. She only kept her hands moving. The evening smelled of tomato leaves, damp twine, and the first cut grass from Elise's field. Swallows dipped above the pasture. Juniper watched Miriam tie one vine, then another. After a while, the bobcat lowered herself into the narrow shade beside the carrots, paws forward, head high. Miriam felt tears come without warning. She did not wipe them at first. They were not sad exactly. They were the body's quiet answer to being trusted by something that had every reason not to trust. After Harold died, people had tried to comfort her by saying time would heal. But time had not healed in a straight line. It had only made room for different kinds of presence. This one had amber eyes and a notched ear. Miriam tied the last pea vine. Juniper rose before the light was gone. She stepped carefully around the carrots, paused at the clay pot, tapped it once as if checking its manners, then slid beneath the rail and back into the tall grass. Miriam stayed kneeling in the garden until the first star appeared. The house behind her would still be quiet when she went in. The chair at the kitchen table would still be pulled out. The yellow mug would still need washing. But the silence no longer felt like an empty room. It felt like a fence line at dawn, waiting. June came in warm and green, carrying the smell of tomato leaves, cut hay, and the river mud that drifted up after watering. Miriam's garden thickened almost overnight. Pea blossoms opened like small white flags. Beans climbed their poles with a confidence that tomatoes had not yet found. The marigolds Elise had once called a little nonsense marched along the fence in orange and gold, rowdy enough to make the cabbage look offended. Juniper noticed all of it. She had taken to arriving just after Miriam filled the blue bowl, as if she preferred to let the woman complete the first part of the ritual without supervision. Then the tall grass would fold near the loose rail. A tawny shoulder would appear. The notched ear would lift. Juniper would step into view with the solemn air of a neighbor checking property standards. Miriam never greeted her too brightly. "Morning," she would say, keeping her eyes on the soil. Juniper would blink once or not at all. Their days settled into a quiet choreography. Miriam weeded the carrot bed. Juniper watched from beyond the fence. Miriam watered the tomatoes. Juniper followed the shining arc of water with her eyes, but never came near enough to be splashed. Miriam set her yellow mug on the flat stone by the gate. Juniper sniffed toward it and seemed to disapprove of coffee as a general principle. One morning, Miriam forgot the mug on the stone and went inside to answer the phone. When she returned, Juniper stood 3 feet away from it, neck stretched forward, whiskers trembling. She did not touch it. She only leaned close enough to inspect the chip on the rim. "That belonged to Harold," Miriam said softly from the porch. Juniper looked at her, then at the mug, then backed away as though the object carried a history too human to be trusted. Miriam felt the old ache stir, but it arrived without the old weight. She could say Harold's name in the garden now. Not every day, not easily, but sometimes. The sound did not break anything. It simply joined the birds, the gate latch, and the hush of Juniper's paws in the grass. Small joys came without asking permission. The first was the morning Juniper found a fallen green tomato beneath the lowest vine. She sniffed it, touched it with one paw, and sent it rolling down the row. The movement startled her. She sprang sideways, then crouched with her rear lifted and tail tip twitching, watching the tomato as if it had insulted her and might try again. Miriam had to turn her face toward the beans to hide her smile. The second came the day Elise brought 2 teacups instead of biscuits. She said Miriam needed a proper garden tea, though the tea was only from a paper bag and the cups did not match. They sat on the porch while Juniper watched from behind the marigolds. Every time Elise lifted her floral cup, Juniper's ears followed the motion. When Elise lowered it, the ears lowered too. After 3 tries, Elise whispered, "I think she's training me." Miriam nearly spilled her tea. The third came from Pickle, who had resumed his visits with exaggerated caution. The orange tomcat had discovered that if he sat on the truck hood and faced away from the garden, he could pretend the bobcat did not exist. Unfortunately, his tail betrayed him, flicking every time Juniper moved. Juniper, who treated most drama as weather, watched the tail for several minutes and then gave one silent little chuff through her nose. Pickle turned, saw her looking, and immediately began washing his shoulder with the dignity of a creature who had never been afraid in his life. Miriam laughed then, not loudly, just enough. Juniper did not run. That stayed with Miriam all afternoon. The bobcat had not accepted laughter exactly, but she had not fled from it. There were many kinds of trust too small for people to name while they were happening. A wild animal remaining in place while two women drank tea. A notched ear turning toward a familiar gate latch. Paw prints appearing near the watering can and staying there long enough for morning sun to dry around them. Miriam began finding those paw prints often. They were never near the porch. Juniper did not cross that line. But sometimes, after dawn, Miriam would find a soft trail along the inside edge of the garden, where the bobcat had passed beneath the rail before the house woke. The prince circled the bean trellis, paused near the blue bowl, and once crossed directly beside the flat stone where the yellow mug sat. Miriam never swept them away. She stepped around them while carrying twine. She watered around them when she could. When rain blurred them, she did not feel cheated. It was better that way, she thought. Wild signs were meant to be temporary. Their disappearing was part of their truth. One evening, as sunset warmed the cedar fence, Miriam carried a chipped white teacup outside instead of the yellow mug. Harold's mug felt too full of memory for the softness of that hour, and she wanted something lighter in her hands. She sat on the porch steps and watched the garden breathe. Juniper appeared late. The bobcat came from the ferns with a vole in her mouth, moving more strongly now, though still careful on uneven ground. She passed the blue bowl without drinking and stopped at the fence. For a moment she looked not at Miriam, but beyond her, toward the house with its lit kitchen window and one chair pulled slightly out from the table. Miriam wondered what the animal saw there. Shelter, maybe. Danger, maybe. Juniper's world did not need Miriam's meanings. Still, the bobcat lowered the vole near the outside of the fence, not quite at the rail, not quite away from it. Then she sat. Miriam looked at the small offering and understood enough not to romanticize it. Juniper was a hunter. She was marking a place, perhaps. She was following instincts Miriam would never fully read. But the fact remained that the bobcat had brought part of her wild work to the boundary they shared. Miriam bowed her head slightly. "Thank you for letting me be nearby," she whispered. Juniper gave one slow blink. The sun slipped behind the hazelnut trees. The marigolds glowed. The white teacup cooled in Miriam's hand. And for a little while, with the fence between them and the evening folding around them both, the garden felt almost full. The warning signs did not arrive like thunder. They came softly, hidden inside ordinary mornings. A cup set down too hard, a phone ringing before dawn, a jacket left on the peg because its owner had never been put on again. With Juniper, it began with the blue bowl. For weeks, the bobcat had treated that dented enamel bowl as if it were a household matter requiring daily correction. She turned it, shoved it beneath ferns, dragged leaves over the rim. Once, after a dry, windy night, Miriam found it upside down with a beetle trapped beneath it. But in the second week of June, the bowl stayed exactly where Miriam placed it. Morning after morning, the dent faced the same direction. No fern curtain appeared, no paw mark pressed the mud around it. The water lowered, so Juniper was drinking, but she no longer fussed with it. At first, she told herself not to make a sorrow out of a bowl. Wild creatures changed habits for reasons people could not read. A new scent in the grass, a nesting bird nearby, heat, weather, restlessness. Still, when she carried her yellow mug to the porch, she looked first at the bowl, then at the trees. June had turned warmer than usual. The garden smelled of tomato leaves. Bees stitched gold lines through the lavender. The marigolds blazed against the fence, and the old gate latch clicked dryly. Juniper appeared less often in the full morning light. When she did come, she remained half hidden beyond the rail, her body low in the grass. Her coat looked uneven again along one shoulder. Small burrs clung beneath her chin. She scratched at them once, then stopped, as if the effort cost more than it should. Miriam watched from the porch and kept her hand still. "You've been busy somewhere," she said softly. Juniper did not blink. The bobcat stared toward the dark stand of firs beyond the pasture. That became another sign. She watched the woods more than the garden now. Her ears moved constantly, separating every sound. A tractor on the county road, a jay in the hazelnuts, a twig snapping far beyond the drainage ditch. Once, while Miriam was tying up tomato vines, Juniper spun so sharply toward the tree line that her injured hind leg slipped under her. She caught herself quickly, proud as ever, but Miriam's chest tightened. The warmth did not disappear. It only changed shape. One morning, Juniper came with a dry grass stem stuck across her back, like a crooked parade banner. Miriam wanted badly to remove it, which was exactly why she did not. At last, a breeze lifted the grass away, and Juniper glared at empty air, as if the wind had overstepped. Another day, Elise brought raspberry jam and whispered, "Your neighbor looks like she's chairing a serious meeting." Juniper sat beyond the fence with one paw on a cedar cone, eyes narrowed toward the woods. Miriam answered, "She hasn't approved the minutes." Elise pressed her lips together until her shoulders shook silently. The third warmth came from the scarecrow. Harold had made it from an old flannel shirt and a straw hat that never stayed level. Juniper had ignored it all spring. But one hot afternoon, she sniffed the frayed sleeve, sneezed directly at its wooden leg, and moved away with clear satisfaction. Miriam treasured those moments more carefully as worry gathered around them. She called Jonah again after she saw Juniper refuse a climb. It happened near dusk. The light had gone copper across the garden, and swallows were cutting low over the pasture. A squirrel crossed the top rail of the fence near the bean trellis. In healthier weeks, Juniper would have flowed upward with that quick, impossible strength that made Miriam's old bones ache in admiration. This time the bobcat crouched, measured the distance, then stayed on the ground. Her tail flicked twice. The squirrel vanished. Juniper looked after it, then lowered herself in the grass. Miriam went inside and dialed Jonah before she could talk herself out of it. He listened, asked questions, and grew quiet when she described the burrs, the still bull, the guarded movements, the watchfulness toward the firs. "Could she be sick?" Miriam asked. "Maybe," Jonah said. "Or stressed, or protecting something. June can be complicated for females." "Protecting something," she repeated. "Possibly. I don't want you searching. If there are kittens, she'll hide them well. Getting too close could make her move them, and moving them takes strength." Kittens. The word entered the kitchen gently and changed the air. Miriam had not let herself imagine it, though now many things rearranged themselves in memory. Juniper's careful schedule, her sharpened attention, the way she moved toward the woods with purpose rather than simply away. Jonah continued, "Keep doing what you're doing. Water, distance, no crowding. If she appears unable to move, call me immediately. Otherwise, let her decide." After the call, Miriam remained by the sink until the porch light came on by itself. The glass reflected her face back at her, gray hair pinned carelessly, garden dirt near one cheek, eyes older than she expected. She thought of motherhood then, not as a sentimental picture, but as a kind of weather a body carried. Nora had been born during a stormy March night, and Miriam still remembered the fierce terror of loving someone who could not protect herself. Even after Nora grew and left, Miriam had never stopped listening for danger in rooms where her daughter no longer slept. If Juniper carried that same ancient vigilance in a wild body, then every restless glance toward the firs meant more than Miriam had known how to hold. The next morning, Juniper did not come at dawn. The blue bowl remained full. Miriam waited on the porch until her coffee went cold. The garden brightened. Bees woke. Pickle climbed onto the truck hood, saw Miriam's face, and for once did not perform his usual offended inspection. He simply sat facing the fence, tail curled over his paws, as if keeping watch, badly, but sincerely. At noon, Miriam found one fresh paw print in the mud outside the rail. By evening, the woods beyond the pasture felt larger than they had before. The firs darkened early. A crow called once, then again. Miriam stood at the garden gate with the yellow mug in her hand and did not open it. Click-Click stayed silent. For the first time since April, she was afraid of what might be waiting beyond the fence. The night Juniper disappeared, the rain came sideways. It began before supper as a gray pressure over the valley. The kind that made swallows vanish low and the hazelnut leaves turn their pale undersides to the sky. Miriam had been in the kitchen rinsing lettuce when the first gust pressed hard against the window. The glass shivered. The porch light blinked once, then steadied. She looked toward the garden. The cedar fence had gone dark with wet. The marigolds bent their bright heads under the wind, and the bean poles clicked softly against one another. Beyond the far rail, the firs stood in a thick blue wall, their tops moving in heavy, restless waves. Juniper had not come that morning. She had not come at dusk. The blue bowl remained full, rain dimpling its surface until it looked alive. Miriam told herself not to stand at the window all night. She told herself wild mothers knew storms older than houses, older than fences, older than worry itself. But every time the wind shoved at the back door, her body answered before reason could stop it. She dried her hands. She checked the latch. She went back to the sink. Then a sound came from beyond the garden. Not a cry exactly, not loud. A thin, rough note carried apart by wind. Miriam froze. The lettuce slipped from her hand into the basin. For a moment, there was only rain against glass, hard and slanting. Then it came again, shorter this time, from somewhere past the fence line, near the low drainage ditch where water gathered after heavy weather. Miriam reached for the porch light switch. The yard jumped into a pale, trembling circle. Rain streaked through it like threads of silver. The garden gate swung slightly in the wind, but held. Click, pause, click. Not the full click-click of Miriam's hand closing it, only the latch nudging against itself, nervous and incomplete. She put on Harold's old raincoat without thinking. It still hung beside the door, too large in the shoulders, smelling faintly of waxed canvas and cedar shavings. She had not worn it in years. The sleeves covered half her hands. The weight of it nearly made her sit down again. Another sound came. Cold rain struck her face at once. The porch board groaned beneath her boots. Somewhere under the truck, Pickle gave a low complaint and retreated deeper into shadow. The clay pot by the steps rolled in the wind, bumped the wall, and rolled back again, as if even harmless things had become unsettled. Elise, Miriam whispered. But Elise was half a mile away, and the storm swallowed the name. She did not cross the garden. That was the promise. She stood at the top of the steps, rainwater running from the brim of Harold's hood, and peered toward the fence. The blue bowl gleamed beyond the rail. Grass flattened and rose. The marigolds thrashed like small flames. Then she saw movement near the loose rail. Low, tawny, Juniper. The bobcat emerged from the grass with her body pressed close to the ground. She was soaked so completely that her coat looked dark and narrow. The spots along her legs blurred by rain. Her notched ear lay flat. Her mouth opened slightly as she drew scent through the storm. She moved toward the fence, then stopped, looking back toward the drainage ditch. Miriam's heart climbed into her throat. Juniper was not alone in her attention. Something in the woods had drawn every line of her body tight. A coyote yipped far beyond the firs. Then another answered, closer. Juniper turned sharply. Her injured hind legs slipped in the mud, and for one terrible second she nearly went down. She caught herself, but not with her usual brace. She stood trembling, head low, listening. Miriam gripped the porch rail. "Juniper," she breathed. The bobcat looked toward her. It was the first time Miriam had spoken the name aloud in the animal's presence. She had not meant to. The storm had pulled it out of her, stripped of sense and caution. Juniper did not run from the sound. She stared through the rain, amber eyes catching the porch light. For one breath, the whole world seemed to hold between them. The blue bowl, the crooked gate, the old raincoat, the fence Harold had built, the distance Miriam had promised never to steal. Then a tiny shape moved in the grass behind Juniper. Miriam saw it only as a darker ripple near the blackberry tanes. Juniper spun back. The coyote call came again, nearer to the ditch. Miriam understood then, not fully, but enough. Jonah's quiet word from the kitchen returned with the force of weather. "Kittens." Juniper vanished toward the sound, not away from danger, toward it. Miriam took one step down. The porch board creaked under her boot, and the old habit of helping surged through her so forcefully that her hands shook. She wanted to run into the rain, wanted to lift the loose rail, wanted to search every fern and blackberry cane, until whatever small life hid there was found. But Jonah's warning stood beside her like a hand on her shoulder. Do not mistake trust for permission. Miriam stopped. The storm filled the space where action should have been. She stumbled back inside and called Jonah with wet fingers. The phone nearly slipped from her hand. He answered on the fourth ring, his voice rough with sleep or worry. She told him what she had heard: the bobcat, the movement, the coyotes, the ditch. "Stay inside," he said immediately. But she went toward them. "I know. Miriam, listen to me. If there are kittens and you go out there, you may scatter them. You may pull her attention from where it needs to be. Keep your porch light on. Keep the yard quiet. I'm going to head that direction, but roads may be bad. Do not go into the woods." Miriam closed her eyes. Rain hammered the roof. "All right," she said, though the words hurt. After the call, she left every backlight on. Kitchen, porch, mudroom, even the small lamp over Harold's workbench in the shed, its yellow square glowing through the rain. Not to summon Juniper like a pet. Not to claim her, only to leave a known edge in the storm. Hours passed. The coyotes quieted. The rain softened after midnight, then thickened again before dawn. Miriam did not sleep. She sat in the kitchen wrapped in Harold's raincoat, the yellow mug untouched beside her. Once the blue bowl appeared to move in the porch light, but it was only rainwater overflowing the rim. Once Pickle scratched at the door, and she led him into the mudroom, where he sat damp and indignant on an old towel, no longer pretending bravery. Near 4, the garden gate nudged in the wind. Click. Miriam rose so quickly the chair scraped the floor. Click. She went to the window. The fence stood empty. No notched ear, no amber eyes, no tawny shape at the loose rail. Only rain, mud, bent grass, and the full blue bowl waiting where Juniper had left it. At dawn, Jonah's truck lights crawled up the lane through the gray. Elise arrived 5 minutes later in rubber boots, her hair tucked badly under a knit cap, carrying a flashlight she did not need. They found Miriam standing at the back door with Harold's raincoat hanging heavy around her. None of them said the thing they feared. Outside, the storm had written over everything. Paw prints blurred into dark patches. The drainage ditch ran brown and loud. One broken marigold lay against the fence, bright as a small fallen flag. Miriam stood behind the cedar rails, hands wrapped around the gate latch. She did not open it. Click-click stayed trapped beneath her fingers. For the first time since Juniper had come into her life, the garden fence did not feel like a meeting place. It felt like the edge of a world she could not enter. Jonah would not let Miriam search until the light was strong enough to show what the storm had tried to hide. That was hard for her. She stood in the mudroom while he pulled on waterproof gloves and checked the flashlight clipped to his vest, though morning had already begun to pale the fields. Elise waited beside the porch steps, with her knit cap crooked over one ear, breathing into her hands. The rain had softened to a cold mist that clung to hair, sleeves, fence rails, and the edges of everything unsaid. The garden looked bruised. Bean poles leamed. Marigolds lay bent along the cedar fence. The blue bowl had filled past the rim and spilled a narrow stream down the grass. Every smell seemed sharpened by the storm. Mud, crushed tomato leaves, wet cedar, the metallic scent of running ditch water beyond the pasture. Miriam reached for the gate latch. Jonah touched her sleeve gently. "Slow," he said. "We look from the edges first." She nodded, though her fingers stayed curled near the latch. Click, click. The sound came small and sad in the wet morning. They moved through the garden without speaking. Jonah went ahead, not because Miriam could not, but because he knew how to read what she might trample in fear. He crouched near the loose rail, studying the mud. Elise stood very still behind him, holding the flashlight with both hands, though it was turned off. Miriam remained by the carrots, gripping the yellow mug she had carried outside without noticing. It was empty. She had not made coffee. The mug had simply come with her, as if some part of her needed something familiar to hold while the world shifted again. Jonah pointed to a shallow mark near the rail. "Bobcat," he said softly, moving fast. Miriam stepped closer. The print was blurred, but she could see the curve of it. One front paw, then another, a sliding scrape where the hind foot had lost purchase in the mud. A few yards away, rain had nearly erased a second track, smaller and rounder, too faint for Miriam to understand. Jonah studied it longer. He did not say kitten. That silence told Miriam more than the word would have. They followed the fence line first, not entering the deeper trees. Jonah explained each movement in a low voice, not as a lecture, but as something to give Miriam's fear a shape. Here, flattened grass. There, a broken fern. A tuft of tawny fur caught on blackberry cane, wet and dark at the tip. Juniper had passed this way. Juniper had been alive here. Miriam repeated that inside herself. Alive here. Alive here. At the far corner of the garden, Elise slipped in the mud and caught herself against the scarecrow. Its straw hat tipped forward over its button eyes, and for one absurd second, it looked ashamed of not helping. Elise whispered, "Sorry, Harold," because Harold had made the thing, and Miriam let out the smallest breath that almost became a laugh. That was the first warmth of that terrible morning, and Miriam held it like a match cupped against wind. The second came from Pickle. The orange tomcat had been ordered inside, but he appeared in the mudroom window, round-eyed and deeply betrayed, pressing one paw against the glass as if filing a complaint about poor management. Elise saw him and murmured, "He's leading the search from headquarters." Miriam did not smile, but the tightness around her mouth softened. The third came when Jonah found the blue bowl's fern curtain plastered against the fence. He lifted it carefully with 2 fingers. "She still had opinions," he said. Miriam closed her eyes. For a moment, she could see Juniper nudging that fern into place, correcting the world in her private, particular way. The image steadied her more than hope did. They reached the drainage ditch after nearly an hour of careful looking. The water ran high and brown between banks thick with sword ferns and salmonberry brambles. Rain tapped from the fir branches overhead. The air was colder there, shaded and full of the rushing sound of runoff. Miriam had not come this far behind the pasture in months. Harold used to clear this ditch every fall before the heavy rains. He would return with mud on his knees and cedar needles in his hair, proud of some small improvement no one else could see. After he died, Miriam had hired a neighbor boy twice, then let the wild growth take back the banks. Standing there now, she wondered how many places grief had allowed to grow over, simply because she could not bear to tend them alone. Jonah crouched near a flattened patch under the brambles. Miriam's heart stopped moving. There was a hollow in the grass, pressed low and dry beneath the thickest leaves, a place where an animal had rested, maybe more than once. Bits of pale fur clung to a twig, not a dull fur, softer, lighter. Elise made a sound and covered it with her hand. Jonah looked up at Miriam. "This may have been a denning spot," he said quietly, "or a temporary shelter." "Was?" Miriam asked. He did not answer quickly. Rainwater moved down the brim of his cap. "There are no bodies here," he said at last. "That matters. No strong scent of death. No heavy blood sign. I see movement away from the ditch, but the storm damaged most of it." Miriam tried to receive the mercy in those words. No bodies here, no strong sign, movement away. But the mind could be cruel in the space between signs. It filled what the eyes could not. She saw Juniper soaked and limping, turning toward coyotes. She saw small hidden bodies in wet grass. She saw Harold in a hospital bed, breath shallow, hands still worn, while people said phrases meant to help, and none of them did. Loss had a way of changing costumes. A husband, a daughter living far away, a wild neighbor with a notched ear. It always found the same room inside her and knew where to sit. Miriam pressed the yellow mug against her chest. "I should have done more," she whispered. Jonah stood slowly. "No," he said. "You did what kept her coming back." Miriam looked toward the rushing ditch. "She came back to the fence because I stayed away." "Yes, and now she's gone." Jonah did not soften the truth by pretending otherwise. That was one reason Miriam trusted him. "For now," he said. They searched until noon. They found 3 more signs. A scrape on wet bark where claws had caught, a second tuft of fur near the deer path, and one tiny print beneath a fern where rain had not reached. Jonah photographed it, measured it with his fingers, and said nothing for a long time. Miriam knew then there had truly been kittens. Knowing did not comfort her. It only made the empty fence larger. By early afternoon, the mist lifted enough to show the hills beyond Maple Hollow, green and indifferent under ragged clouds. Jonah advised them to stop before their searching became disturbance rather than help. Juniper, if alive and moving, needed the woods quiet. If she had relocated the kittens, human feet could push her farther. So they walked back. Miriam paused at the garden gate. Mud clung to her boots. Her hem was soaked. The yellow mug was cold in her hands. Beyond the fence, the blue bull waited under its wet fern curtain. No amber eyes watched from the grass. No notched ear lifted near the rail. Miriam closed the gate. Click, click. The sound did not answer anything. Inside the kitchen, Elise made tea without asking. Jonah left his number written again in darker pencil on the seed catalog, though Miriam already had it memorized. Pickle sat on Harold's chair and looked offended when no one moved him. Miriam stood at the window until the glass reflected her own face over the empty garden. She had thought loving Juniper from a distance would protect her from this. But distance had not made the ache smaller. It had only made the love honest. Juniper returned on the 3rd evening, when the whole garden had begun to smell like wet wood warming under late sun. By then, Miriam had learned the terrible length of 3 days. The first day had been action, Jonah's careful search, Elise's steady hands, the muddy walk along the drainage ditch. The second day had been waiting, sharpened into listening. Every sound outside the window pulled Miriam from her chair. A jay in the hazelnuts, a branch settling, Pickle jumping onto the truck hood with his usual soft thump. Each small noise became hope before it became ordinary again. The third day was quieter. That frightened her most. The weather had cleared by afternoon, leaving the fields rinsed and bright beneath broken clouds. Water still gathered in low places along the garden path. The marigolds lifted themselves a little, though several blossoms had browned at the edges. The blue bowl sat by the fern, clean and full, its dent facing the direction Miriam had stopped correcting. She had not gone to the seed store that morning. Mr. Granger had called once, and when she said only, "Not today," he had answered, "Take the time you need," without asking what kind of loss had happened or whether it had finished happening. Miriam spent most of the day on the porch. She did not call into the woods. She did not walk the ditch again. Jonah had told her to leave the tree line quiet, and Miriam held to that instruction with the stubbornness of a woman who understood that love sometimes had to sit still while fear paced. Elise came by near 4 with chicken soup in a jar and a heel of bread wrapped in wax paper. "You don't have to eat it," she said, setting it on the porch table. "But I had to bring something, or my hands would start making pies from panic." Miriam looked at the jar, then at Elise, and for the first time that day her mouth softened. Panic pies sound dangerous. They are. Too much cinnamon and no judgment. That was the first warmth of the evening. Small but real. And it kept the porch from feeling like a waiting room. The second came from Pickle, who climbed onto the bottom step, considered Miriam's lap, then chose instead to sit on Harold's old boot scraper as if it were a throne. He faced the fence with grave importance. Elise whispered, "He's promoted himself." Miriam nodded. "Interim supervisor." Pickle narrowed his eyes as though the title were beneath him. By sunset, Elise had gone home to check her own place, promising to keep her porch light on. Miriam remained outside with the yellow mug between her palms. She had made coffee, but had not drunk much. The rim touched her lower lip now and then, familiar and chipped, while her eyes stayed on the cedar rails. The light changed slowly. Gold slid down the bean poles. The wet leaves of the tomatoes shone and then dulled. A mist began to lift from the pasture in thin strips. Beyond the garden, the firs gathered shadow at their roots. Miriam's thoughts moved toward Harold, as they often did when the day ended. She remembered the way he used to stand at the fence after supper, one hand hooked over the top rail, pretending to inspect his crooked posts while really watching bats begin their evening work. He had loved useful silence. Miriam had not understood until after he was gone how much companionship could live inside two people saying nothing. Now she sat alone in that silence, and it still had room for another creature's absence. A movement came near the far rail. Miriam did not trust it at first. A fern lifted, then settled. The tall grass parted near the animal path. Something low and tawny paused where the last sun touched the wet blades. Miriam stood too quickly. The wicker chair scraped the porch boards. The shape froze. Miriam held her breath. Juniper stood beyond the fence. For a moment, Miriam could not feel her hands around the mug. The bobcat looked smaller than before, narrowed by exhaustion, her coat rough with dried mud and burrs. The notch in her ear showed dark against the fading light. Her left hind leg trembled once before she tucked it beneath herself. One cheek carried a smear of wet clay. Her bent right whisker stuck out at an odd angle, stubborn as ever. But her eyes were open, amber, watchful, alive. Miriam lifted one hand to her mouth and stopped it there. She did not step down. She did not say the name that rose so hard in her throat it hurt. She only stood under the porch light as it clicked on above her, letting Juniper see that the house had remained where she left it. The bobcat looked toward the blue bowl. Then she looked behind her. The movement was so slight, Miriam might have missed it on any other evening. Juniper's head turned toward the blackberry canes beyond the fence, and her ears angled back, not in fear, but in attention. Her body shifted as if she were shielding something from the open garden. The grass behind her trembled. Miriam's heart gave one heavy beat. She thought of the tiny print under the fern, Jonah's silence, the rough sound in the storm. The word kittens, never fully spoken at the fence. Juniper took one step toward the bowl, then stopped. She seemed to be measuring the world again. Porch, woman, light, fence, water, danger, memory. Her mouth opened slightly to taste the air. A drop of mud fell from her chest to the grass. Pickle, who had remained on the boot scraper, saw her and forgot his promotion. He slid backward until only his ears showed above the porch step. That was the third warmth, ridiculous and tender, and it nearly broke Miriam's composure. Juniper lowered her head and drank. Not long, only a few quick laps, followed by a pause to listen. She kept looking back toward the weeds. Once, she gave a low sound so soft, Miriam felt it more than heard it. Not a call to Miriam, not a warning, a mother's thread of sound cast into the grass behind her. Something small shifted there again. Miriam did not move. Tears blurred the fence, the bowl, the tawny body bent over water. She let them come silently. She had spent 3 days bargaining with empty air, promising she would ask for nothing if only Juniper had survived. Now survival stood before her, muddy and thin and unwilling to be touched. It was enough. Juniper lifted her head. Water clung to her whiskers. She looked at Miriam for a long time. Then she blinked, slowly, not weakly, not sleepily, the same deliberate closing and opening from the rain morning, offered now across a wider distance and a deeper dark. When she looked up again, Juniper had stepped backward toward the blackberry canes. The grass moved once behind her, then stilled. The bobcat remained there until the last light left the fence, guarding whatever secret she had carried home. Miriam stayed on the porch until night settled fully over the garden. She did not follow. She only turned on the small lamp in Harold's shed, filled the blue bowl once more, and left the house, glowing gently at the edge of Juniper's wild world. The days after Juniper returned were quieter than Miriam expected. She had imagined that relief would make the house feel bright, that she would move through the rooms with a lifted heart and steadier hands. Instead, relief made everything tender. It softened the edges of her fear, but did not remove them. It left her listening more carefully than before, pausing at the sink when the wind touched the back window, rising from her chair whenever a fern shifted near the fence. Juniper was alive. That was the mercy. Juniper was also tired, guarded, and carrying a secret somewhere beyond the blackberry canes. That was the responsibility. Jonah came the next morning with a canvas bag, a small pair of binoculars, and the quiet face of a man who knew good news did not always arrive clean and simple. He stood beside Miriam on the porch while the garden steamed under the first warm sun after the storm. Everything smelled of wet cedar, bruised marigolds, and soil turned dark by rain. A robin pulled at a worm near the bean poles, tugged too hard, fell backward, and flew off as if embarrassed. Elise, who had arrived with a jar of oatmeal in more worry than she admitted, whispered, "Even the birds are dramatic this week." Miriam's laugh was barely a breath, but it was there. That was the first warmth of the morning. Jonah did not cross the fence at once. He watched the far grass, the blue bowl, the loose rail, and the darker opening where Juniper had vanished the night before. "She came back to drink," he said. "Yes." "And she looked behind her more than once?" Miriam nodded. He lifted the binoculars, but kept his body still. "Then we helped the edge, not the hidden place." So they worked at the edge, not loudly, not quickly. Jonah showed Miriam how to make a simple shelter near the outside of the fence without turning it into a trap or a lure too close to the house. They used an old wooden produce crate from Harold's shed, the one Miriam had once filled with apples and then forgotten beneath a tarp. Jonah tipped it on its side beneath the overhanging fern, weighted the top with flat stones, and lined the back with dry straw from Elise's chicken coop. "Only shelter from weather," he said. "No touching, no reaching in. If she uses it, she uses it. If she ignores it, that's her choice." Miriam repeated the words in her mind. Her choice. Those words had become the shape of caring. She placed the blue bowl a little nearer to the crate, still beyond the fence, still away from the porch. Jonah approved with a nod. Then he left a small note on the kitchen table with signs to watch for: weakness, confusion, labored breathing, inability to move. Miriam read the list twice and folded it beneath the seed envelope where she had written about the slow blink. Juniper did not appear while Jonah was there, but near dusk, when the sun had dropped low enough to set the wet rails glowing, the bobcat came from the blackberry canes. Miriam sat on the porch step with both hands around the yellow mug. Elise sat behind her in Harold's wicker chair, holding herself so still that even Pickles seemed impressed. The orange tomcat had taken up a position inside the mudroom window where he could observe danger while claiming he had chosen indoor leadership. Her coat was cleaner than the night before, though burrs still clung under her chin. She paused every few steps to listen back toward the weeds. The notched ear lifted, dropped, lifted again. Her left hind leg looked stiff, but she placed it more surely than she had during the storm. She saw the crate. Her whole body lowered. Miriam could almost feel the suspicion move through her. New shape, new smell, human hands, straw, stones, a box where no box had been. Juniper circled it once, wide enough that she never had to put her head inside. She sniffed a stone. She sniffed the fern. She sniffed the blue bowl and nudged it half an inch, perhaps to remind everyone that some standards remained under her authority. Elise whispered, "She's redecorating." Miriam did not answer, but her shoulders softened. That was the second warmth. Juniper drank, then stepped backward toward the weeds without using the shelter. Miriam felt the small fall of disappointment and let it pass through without clinging to it. Jonah had warned her. A gift refused by a wild creature was not an insult. It was information. The next morning, the straw had been disturbed. Not much. Just one shallow hollow pressed into the back corner of the crate, and a single tawny hair caught along the rough edge of wood. Miriam crouched inside the fence, careful not to touch the shelter, and felt joy rise so quickly it frightened her. She tried it, Elise said from the gate. Miriam nodded. Pickle, arriving late on the truck hood, looked at the crate and then at Miriam as if deeply unimpressed by housing that did not include upholstery. That was the third warmth, and Miriam carried it with her through the day. Healing did not look like a miracle. It looks like water checked at dawn. Straw replaced only when rain dampened the front edge. A porch light left on during cloudy evenings, not bright enough to flood the woods, only soft enough to mark the familiar place. It looked like Miriam keeping her hands folded in her lap when Juniper rested near the crate, though every older motherly instinct in her wanted to remove burrs, smooth fur, mend what hurt. The bobcat chose nearness in inches. One evening she sat beside the shelter while Miriam watered the tomatoes. Another evening she lay under the fern with her head lifted, eyes half closed, but ears awake. Once, when a farm truck rattled down the lane, she slipped backward into shadow so quickly Miriam saw only the black tip of her tail vanish. 10 minutes later, she returned, gave the blue bowl a sharp push, and settled again, as if embarrassed by having been startled. Miriam understood that too. There were wounds a person kept moving around long after the danger had passed. A hospital smell, an empty chair, a phone call after dark. The body remembered what the mind tried to set down. Perhaps Juniper's body remembered the storm. Perhaps it remembered hunger. Perhaps it remembered something older than either. So Miriam did not rush the healing. She let the garden grow around it. By the end of the week, Juniper's coat looked smoother. She groomed the burrs from her chin one patient tug at a time. Her limp eased again. She drank daily and sometimes slept in the crate long enough for the straw to keep her shape after she left. But always, before vanishing, she looked back toward the blackberry canes. Miriam saw it every time. A mother did not heal alone when something small waited in the grass. Miriam did not follow that glance. She only filled the bowl, checked the straw, and kept the cedar fence between love and longing. The kittens appeared on a morning so clear and gentle that Miriam almost missed the miracle because she was fussing over aphids. She had been kneeling beside the bean poles with a damp cloth in one hand and her glasses sliding down her nose. The sun had only just cleared the hazelnut trees, but already the garden held the warm green smell of June leaves. Bees worked the lavender near the porch steps. A breeze moved through the marigolds, setting their orange heads nodding against the cedar fence, like a row of neighbors pretending not to gossip. Juniper had not come to the blue ball at dawn. Miriam noticed, of course. She noticed everything now. But she did not panic. The shelter straw had been pressed down during the night, and the water had lowered by a finger's width. Juniper had been there. That was enough to let Miriam tend the beans and give the woods their privacy. She wiped one aphid from a leaf and murmured, "You are not invited." From the porch, Pickle watched through the mudroom screen with the solemn disapproval of a cat who believed all insects were beneath household standards. Miriam glanced at him. "You could help." Pickle looked away. That was the first warmth of the morning, ordinary and small. Then the grass beyond the far rail moved. Miriam stilled with the cloth pinched between her fingers. Juniper stepped out from the blackberry canes. She looked different in full morning light. Not less wild, never that, but fuller somehow, as if some hidden tension had loosened from her shoulders. Her coat had smoothed along the spine. The notched ears stood high. She paused beside the blue bowl, sniffed it, and did not drink. Instead, she looked toward Miriam. Not a glance, a waiting look. Miriam lowered her eyes at once, then slowly shifted back from the bean row until she sat on the flat garden stone near the path. She did not stand. Standing felt too large. Her heart had begun beating in a strange, careful rhythm, the way it had when Nora took her first steps across the kitchen floor, and Miriam knew any sudden sound might break the moment. Juniper turned toward the blackberry canes. A tiny face appeared in the grass. Miriam's breath left her. The kitten was no bigger than a loaf of bread, round-eared and unsteady, with tawny baby fur that looked almost silver where the sun touched it. Faint spots dusted its sides. Its tail was a short, soft nub with a dark tip barely certain of itself. It lifted one paw high, placed it badly, and sat down at once, as if the earth had made an unreasonable request. Juniper glanced back. Then a second small face pushed through the grass beside the first, darker across the nose and bolder in the shoulders. It tried to climb over a fern stem, failed, bit the fern, and looked personally betrayed by vegetation. The third arrived last. This one was smaller and paler around the muzzle, with enormous amber eyes and a cautious stillness that made Miriam's own body soften. It did not tumble forward like the others. It waited in the blackberry shadow, watching Juniper, watching the fence, watching the woman in the garden who had suddenly forgotten how to breathe. 3 kittens, 3 small lives hidden behind every warning sign, every restless glance, every night Juniper had looked back toward the woods. Miriam lifted one trembling hand to her chest. She did not speak. Juniper moved first. She stepped to the blue bowl and lowered her head, not to drink, but to touch the rim with her nose. Then she looked back at the kittens. The bolder ones stumbled forward, drawn by water or curiosity, or the simple courage of being too young to understand fences. It reached the bowl, sniffed the dented enamel, and sneezed so hard it rocked backward onto its haunches. Miriam pressed her lips together. That was the second warmth, bright enough to sting. The first kitten approached next, stepping on its own front paw and looking surprised each time. The pale one stayed behind Juniper's hind leg. Juniper gave a low sound, barely more than breath. The pale kitten edged forward, then stopped beneath the fern curtain, half hidden and perfect. Miriam thought of the storm, the sideways rain, the coyote calls, Juniper's soaked body turning not toward safety, but toward the ditch. She had carried this secret through fear and hunger and pain. She had come to the fence not as a lonely visitor, but as a mother measuring whether the edge of a human garden might be safer than the deeper dark. Miriam's eyes filled. She looked down at the soil until the tears cleared. She would not let her gaze press too hard on them. They deserved gentleness before wonder. Behind her, the porch screen creaked. Elise stood there with one hand over her mouth, having arrived with biscuits and found the world changed. Her eyes were wide. The paper bag hung forgotten from her fingers. Miriam turned just enough to lift one finger to her lips. Elise nodded so vigorously that her knit cap slipped down over one eyebrow. That was the third warmth, and Miriam nearly laughed through her tears. The kittens explored only a few feet. Juniper allowed no more. When the darker one tried to bat at a marigold through the fence, she stepped between it and the rail with silent authority. When the first kitten wandered toward the clay pot, Juniper caught it with one foreleg and guided it back so smoothly that the little one seemed surprised to find itself redirected. The pale kitten never strayed far from her shadow. Miriam watched the family gather around the bowl and understood the gift for what it was. Not an invitation to interfere, not a claim, a showing. Juniper had brought them near enough to be seen, but not near enough to be handled. She had chosen the fence as the place where trust could stand without becoming captivity. Miriam felt that truth settle in her, deeper than joy. After a few minutes, Juniper lifted her head. The kittens froze because she froze. Their tiny ears turned in 3 different directions, each listening badly, but earnestly. A truck passed far down the county road. The sound faded. Juniper looked at Miriam once. The slow blink came. Miriam bowed her head, one neighbor to another. Then Juniper turned and led her kittens back into the grass. The darker one pounced on its sibling's tail and was gently bumped forward by their mother's nose. The pale one vanished last, like a bit of morning light slipping beneath leaves. When the blackberry cane stilled, Miriam remained on the garden stone. Elise came no farther than the porch steps. For a long while, neither woman said anything. At last, Elise whispered, 3. Miriam nodded. The words seemed too small for what had happened. The garden had not gained pets. Miriam had not gained ownership. But the fence had become something holier than a boundary. It had become the place where a wild mother, cautious and proud, had let an old woman witness the reason she had kept coming back. Miriam looked at the blue bowl, the fern curtain, the pressed grass, the tiny paw marks drying in the sun. Then she whispered, "Hello, little neighbors." After the morning Juniper showed the kittens, Miriam stopped thinking of the garden as hers alone. She still weeded it, watered it, tied the tomato vines, and scolded the beans when they leaned too heavily on their poles. She still opened the gate each dawn to the same crooked click-click. But now, before stepping inside, she paused and looked at the grass beyond the cedar rails with a patience that had become almost prayerful. The garden had grown into high summer. Warmth settled early on the porch boards. Tomato leaves gave off their sharp green scent when Miriam brushed past them, and the marigolds thickened into a bright wall along the fence. Bees worked the lavender so steadily that their humming seemed to stitch the mornings together. Even the blue bowl, with its dent and fern curtain, looked less like an object now and more like part of the land. Sometimes she arrived alone, drank, inspected the shelter, and vanished without bringing the kittens near. Sometimes she came with all three little ones tucked behind her, like shadows that had not learned discipline. Miriam named them only in her notebook, never aloud at the fence. The bold, darker kitten became Bramble. The first unsteady one became Clover. The pale, watchful kitten became Moth. They remained wild in every way that mattered. They startled at trucks. They froze when crows passed overhead. They tested the wind before drinking. Juniper corrected them with a paw, a shoulder, a low sound that carried no anger but allowed no argument. When Bramble tried to squeeze through the loose rail into the garden, Juniper caught the kitten by the scruff and pulled it back so neatly that Bramble sat blinking, offended by motherhood itself. Miriam had to turn toward the peas to hide her smile. That was one of the small warmths of that summer. Another came from Elise, who began leaving biscuits on Miriam's porch with labels in pencil. For actual humans, not for bobcats. Definitely not for Pickle. Pickle ignored the note and sat directly on the bag until Miriam opened the door. Certain written rules did not apply to him. The third came on a bright afternoon when Clover discovered the scarecrow's dangling sleeve. The kitten batted it once through the fence, then leapt back when the sleeve swung in reply. Bramble joined in, pounced too hard, and tumbled into the marigolds outside the rail. Juniper watched with half-closed eyes, as if patience were a burden all mothers carried. Miriam did not laugh loudly. She had learned the correct size of joy. The kittens grew quickly. Their legs lengthened, their spots sharpened, their ears stood taller. Moth remained careful, often sitting beside Juniper instead of wrestling, turning its head at each sound with serious attention. Sometimes Moth looked toward Miriam so steadily that the old woman felt seen by something too young to understand her and too wild to need her. Those looks unsettled her in a gentle way. Miriam had spent years believing love required usefulness. She had been a wife, a mother, a store clerk, a neighbor who remembered who preferred zucchini. After Harold died and Nora's visits became rare, usefulness had thinned around her. But at the fence, she could be present without being needed in the old way. That became a kind of healing she had not expected. Jonah visited every week or so. Juniper's coat had filled out. Her limp had nearly disappeared. The kittens were active, alert, and learning the edges of their small world. "Less dependence is good news," he told Miriam one evening. She nodded, though the sentence had a small thorn in it. Less dependence meant they were well. Less dependence also meant they would one day stop coming. "You gave her a safe edge," Jonah said. Miriam held the yellow mug in both hands. The chip pressed against her finger. She thought of how often people mistook keeping for loving. With Nora, she had called twice when once would have been enough. With Harold's things, she had left boots where no feet would fill them. With grief itself, she had held it close because setting it down felt like another goodbye. Juniper had never allowed that mistake. The bobcat kept the lesson visible. She came near, but not too near. She trusted, but not blindly. She showed her kittens the garden fence, but also the tree line, the ditch, the hidden paths through fern and blackberry. She taught them to wait beneath cover when a truck passed. She taught them that water could sit in a blue bowl by a fence, but home was still the woods. By late July, Miriam noticed the family ranged farther each morning. Sometimes she saw the kittens on the slope beyond the pasture, small tawny flashes in the grass. Sometimes she heard them before she saw them, a rustle, a thump, the sudden silence that followed Juniper's correction. Once Bramble climbed a low fallen branch and seemed astonished to find itself above everyone else. Moth studied the branch, decided wisdom lived on the ground, and sat beside Juniper instead. Clover tried the climb later and slid off backward into the ferns. Miriam wrote that down too. On the porch, her own life widened quietly. Elise came more often because there was room now for easy company. Nora began calling on Sunday evenings after Miriam told her the plain truth. A wild mother at the fence, free kittens, and her father's crooked rail still useful. Miriam pushed Harold's chair under the kitchen table. She did not make a ceremony of it. One morning after breakfast, she simply placed both hands on the chair back and moved it in. Nothing vanished. The room did not become less full of him. If anything, Harold seemed easier to imagine, laughing at the fence he had never repaired properly. That evening, Juniper came alone. She sat beyond the rail while Miriam stood inside the garden, gathering the first ripe tomatoes into her apron. The sky had turned peach behind the hazelnuts. Crickets had begun their small machinery in the grass. The air smelled of warm cedar and dust. Miriam lifted one tomato, as if showing the day's work to a neighbor over a hedge. Juniper blinked once, slow enough to be remembered. Then she rose and slipped back toward the woods, where 3 young sets of footsteps waited somewhere beyond the ferns. Miriam did not follow. She closed the gate behind her. Click, click. This time the sound felt less like an ending than a promise kept. Section 15. Autumn came softly to Maple Hollow, not with a sudden cold, but with a thinning of light. The mornings turned silver at the edges. Mist gathered again in the low pasture, and the hazelnut leaves began to yellow one by one, as if each had made its own private decision. Miriam wore Harold's old brown sweater when she carried coffee to the porch. The sleeves were still too long. The yellow mug still fit her hands as if it remembered them. The garden had slowed. Tomato vines sagged under their last fruit. The beans had gone papery. Marigolds held on with stubborn orange faces, though the first frost would take them soon. The blue bowl remained beyond the fence, but Juniper and the young ones came less often now. That was how it should have been. Miriam told herself this every morning. The kittens were no longer tiny. Bramble had grown into long legs and reckless confidence, forever testing logs, rocks, and Juniper's patience. Clover still moved as though surprised by the world, but now landed on all 4 paws more often than not. Moth remained the quietest, watchful and pale-muzzled, lingering near shadows before crossing open ground. Juniper herself looked strong. Her coat had thickened for the coming cold. The notch in her ear was still there, familiar as the crooked gate latch. Her bent right whisker had finally shed, and a new white one had begun to grow in its place, straight and bright. Miriam noticed that with a tenderness she could not explain. One evening in early October, she found the blue bowl untouched for 2 days. The old fear rose. Then she saw tracks near the far slope, not 1 set but 4, moving away from the garden and toward the deeper firs. The prints were firm, purposeful, not desperate. Juniper had not vanished in weakness. She had moved her family outward. Miriam crouched beside the fence and rested one hand on the cedar rail. The wood was cool beneath her palm. "Well," she whispered, "you did your job." The words hurt, but they were clean. Life became quieter again, though not empty in the old way. Elise still came with biscuits and bad labels. Pickle still occupied whatever place looked least available. Nora called every Sunday evening, and in November she came for 3 days, bringing a blue scarf, 2 grocery bags, and the kind of careful concern adult children carried when they realized their mothers had private lives. Miriam showed her the fence, not the bobcats, because there were none to show that afternoon, only the loose rail, the blue bowl, the produce crate shelter tucked beneath the fern, and the garden stone where Miriam had once sat very still while 3 small faces stepped into the morning. Nora listened without interrupting. When Miriam finished, her daughter touched the cedar rail and said, "Dad would have loved that his bad repair mattered." Miriam laughed then. It came out fuller than she expected. That was the first warmth of the autumn. The second came later, when Pickle attempted to climb into Nora's open suitcase and became trapped in the sleeve of a sweater. He backed out with grave humiliation, while Miriam and Nora pretended not to see, which offended him more than laughter would have. The third came the following morning, when Elise found a single tomato still hanging beneath a dead leaf and declared it the bravest citizen in the garden. Miriam placed it on the kitchen windowsill, where it ripened slowly beside the seed envelope that held Juniper's first notes. By late November, frost silvered the fence before dawn. Miriam stopped filling the blue bowl every day, though she kept it clean and ready. Jonah had told her that bobcats ranged widely, especially as the young grew independent. They might pass through, they might not. The best ending, he said, was not a dramatic goodbye, but a family strong enough to need defenseless. Miriam had nodded when he said it, not the way she had cried after Harold. This grief did not collapse the room. It moved through her like wind through dry grass, bending what remained, proving it was still alive. On the first clear morning of December, Miriam stepped onto the porch before sunrise. The world was blue and still. Frost edged the marigold stalks, now brown and brittle. The garden slept under a thin white breath. She carried the yellow mug and wore Harold's sweater beneath her coat. At the fence, something waited. Miriam stopped on the porch step. Juniper sat beyond the cedar rails. She looked like winter had found her and approved. Her coat was full, her body compact and strong, her amber eyes calm beneath the notched ear. She was alone. No kittens rustled behind her. No small shapes tumbled through the grass. Somewhere beyond the firs, bramble, clover, and moth were learning their own maps. Juniper watched Miriam. The morning smelled of frost, cedar, and distant wood smoke. A chickadee sounded once from the hazelnut tree. The old gate latch held silent in the cold. Juniper rose and walked to the blue bowl. She sniffed it, though it was empty, then nudged the rim until the dent faced east. Miriam covered her mouth with her hand. Even after all that distance, all that growing, all that wild return to wildness, Juniper still had an opinion about the bowl. The bobcat looked toward the porch. Slowly, deliberately, she blinked. Miriam blinked back, not as an imitation, but as a thank you shaped small enough for a wild creature to carry. Then Juniper turned toward the woods. She did not hurry. At the edge of the fir shadow, she paused once and looked back through the pale morning. The fence stood between them, as it always had, honest and kind. Miriam understood then that the miracle had never been that Juniper stayed. The miracle was that she had chosen to wait there at all. Juniper slipped into the trees, silent as breath leaving a room. Miriam remained on the porch until the sun touched the top rail. Then she went down to the garden, opened the gate, and heard the old click-click ring clear in the cold air. She did not feel alone. She carried the blue bowl inside, washed it, dried it, and placed it on the kitchen shelf beside the yellow mug. Not put away, only resting, and if the little farmhouse could have been seen from far above that winter morning, it would have looked very small beneath the Oregon hills. Just a porch light fading in daylight. Just a cedar fence holding frost along its rails. Just an old garden sleeping until spring. Inside, Miriam Bell stood at her kitchen sink and watched steam rise from her coffee. The yellow mug sat near her hand. The blue bowl rested on the shelf, dent turned toward the window. Beyond the glass, the loose rail remained where Harold had left it. No longer a flaw, but a doorway that had once allowed trust to pass through carefully. Juniper belonged to the woods. That truth did not hurt Miriam the way it might have in April. It comforted her now. Somewhere beyond the firs, a notched-eared mother moved through fern and shadow, with her young grown strong enough to follow their own paths. Maybe bramble climbed too high. Maybe clover still stumbled over roots. Maybe moth paused in every patch of light and listened before stepping on. Miriam would never know all of it. Love had become peaceful enough to leave some pages unread. When spring returned, she would plant beans again. She would set marigolds by the fence. She might place the blue bowl outside on hot days, not because she expected anyone, but because kindness could remain available without becoming a demand. And perhaps, one quiet dawn, amber eyes would watch from the grass. Or perhaps only the wind would move there. Either way, the garden had answered back. Thank you for staying with Miriam, Juniper, and the little neighbors at the fence. May your own heart remember the animals that once changed it. May your evening grow quiet. May your home feel warm. And may the last thing you picture tonight be a cedar rail silver with frost and a wild paw print fading softly into morning. End of story. Sleep gently, friends.